After Hours by Eamon Maguire. Mrs. Larrabee rinses the spirit glasses. The sheer regularity of her glass washing has made her performance of the task so automatic and unconscious that she is blissfully unaware that she's broken an average of 3.5 spirit glasses, 2-pint tumblers, and 4.25 half-pint mugs each and every month over the last 5 years. She doesn't notice herself slipping the remnants carefully into the bin at the end of the bar after each breakage. She's always too engrossed in her nightly attempt to forecast, down to the nearest cent, the evening's takings, and with keeping her eye on the sergeant. The sergeant sits at the end of the counter on one of the high stools. In front of him, a large bottle of stout and his bowl of malt. The sergeant buried his barren wife, Maureen, a dozen years ago. Mrs. Larrabee buried her spouse, the unlamented Sean, at the beginning of the last decade. The most prevalent theory in the village has it that the sergeant intends, one of these years, to ask Mrs. Larrabee to commence walking out with him, and that these late-night visitations are merely the preamble to that romantic saga. But the belching, burping sergeant is no oil painting. A mountainous gonker at the peak of his nose lords it over the rest of his puce and pockmarked visage. Mrs. Larrabee wouldn't have him in a month of Sundays. The reason she gives her cronies for the sergeant's after-hour presence in the pub is that he is there in the friendliest capacity to safeguard the takings until they are securely embedded in the little safe under the sink. This lie is mistaken for bashfulness by Mrs. Larrabee's foolish confidants. The real reason, however, for the sergeant's privileged and complimentary drinking is that for the last dozen years or so, he has been blackmailing the widow Larrabee, since the very day, in fact, that she'd buried Sean. Or so she has believed. Mrs. Larrabee knows that when Sean fell gasping to the floor, strangled by a stroke, she delayed for over an hour the urgent telephone call to the doctor, with the result that the man was well beyond relief by the time the black bag was opened on the lino beside him. She could never pin down just how the sergeant got wind of her fateful negligence. She was completely alone with Sean at the time, but his vague, veiled hint of a possible manslaughter, if not murder, she did not leave go unheeded. It all happened so many years ago that neither the sergeant nor Mrs. Larrabee can recall the original pretext for their nightly tryst. The sergeant has never actually experienced sexual desire for an adult female, or indeed for anything human, or even animate. Maureen, his late wife, if she could be called to the stand, would adamantly testify to this. There's a sharp knocking on the door. Mrs. Larrabee and the sergeant exchange mystified glances as she opens the heavy timber door a few tentative inches, only to have it swept out of her grasp as 5 men push past her. One man pauses to relock the door behind them. They are only interested in the sergeant. Mrs. Larrabee decides to mind her own business and scurries behind the counter to continue with the washing up. She doesn't know any of the men by sight, though she can see from the look on the sergeant's face that he recognizes the leader and that he is terribly afraid. "Get out of here, you bloody blackguards!" The leader calmly produces a pistol from his pocket. "Do you remember Tommy MacDonald by any chance?" the leader asks. "Who?" says the sergeant. "He used to speak very affectionately about you to the other lads," the leader says. "Pleurisy it was that did him in. Damp old cells they have nowadays, you know." "I never heard of any fella by that name," states the sergeant. "Sure you must remember little Tommy," the leader says. "Possession with intent, and of course membership, and a few other bits and bobs. You got the poor innocent Get 7 years. Do you recall him now? Might, says the sergeant. Well, it was your name was on his lips when he breathed his last a week ago, said the leader. I'm sure it's a great comfort to you to hear that. The sergeant remained silent. He is shaking so much that if he had a glass in his hand, the whiskey would be all over his tunic by now. Mrs. Larrabee busily polishes another glass. Her hands are steady, her eyes averted from the scene. She has become completely deaf and dumb. The leader jerks the gun closer to the sergeant's face and pulls the trigger. A sharp, hollow, definitive click. The sergeant's eyes almost leap from their sockets. The leader takes 5 bullets from his pocket, which he loads into the gun's magazine. There you are now. 5 bullets and 5 of us. Very neat and mathematical. He places the gun on the counter between the sergeant and himself. Go on. Go for it, he jeers. Would you ever shag off? The sergeant says. Go for it, you yellow bastard. I won't, says the sergeant. You'll have to shoot me down in cold blood. We're 5 unarmed felons. The gun is close to you. If little Tommy's rabbit shooting could turn him into a terrorist on target practice and get you your 3 stripes, sure you'll be the district bloody inspector after you nail us, won't you? It goes on and on. The sergeant makes no move throughout. He's too petrified. After some time, one of the men excuses himself to go to the lavatory. Watching him head for the little door at the back of the bar, the sergeant realizes that he too is dying to go. When the man returns, he asks, in an abrupt whinge if he can. The leader glances behind him to consult the man who has just come back. The man nods. Make it snappy. We haven't got all day, the leader says. The sergeant staggers into the lavatory and closes the door. It's all right, says the man who nodded. There isn't even a window. No way out. I believe the man knows that, the leader says. Mrs. Larrabee finishes counting the takings and tries to look busy. 10 minutes or so elapse, then there is an incomprehensible sound from the lavatory. The leader nods to 2 of the men. They draw revolvers and go inside. They re-emerge in a moment. Go on, see for yourself, one of them says. The leader enters, and a few seconds later from within comes the sound of water splashing onto porcelain, followed by the automatic gush of a sprinkling system. Presently, the leader emerges into the bar again, returns to the counter, and pockets the pistol. The sergeant had a bit of an accident in there. I wouldn't go in if I were you. The 5 men file out the door. Mrs. Larrabee hurriedly locks it after them and races into the lavatory. The sergeant's corpse is so long that though his necktie is attached to the pipe across the ceiling, his boots are almost touching the ground. Mrs. Larrabee sighs and returns to the bar. She washes the sergeant's 2 glasses, then counts the takings once again. When she's sure the figures tally, she sits down and enjoys a leisurely glass of brown rum. After an hour, she goes to the phone.